Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Show Won't Go On, the most shocking, bizarre, and historic deaths of performers on stage, by Jeff Abraham and Burt Kearns. Read by Michael Butler Murray. Prologue. This project began with an Elvis Presley tribute concert in 2004. Elvis's announcer, Al Dvorin, the man who'd say, "Elvis has left the building," at the end of shows back when Elvis was alive, spoke the phrase into a microphone after the performance by Elvis impersonator Paul Casey. Al got a standing ovation, then signed autographs in the lobby. One of us was there at the Trump 29 Casino in Coachella, California that night, when some fan suggested to Al that he write his autobiography. "I know, I keep putting it off," Al replied. "But I will one day. I have time." He set off for home in Las Vegas the next morning, only to be killed in a car crash in the desert. This unfortunate Elvis-related event led to a discussion that turned into an exploration that was even more ambitious and unwieldy than the one you're about to hear. It was a study of performers who died after a show. These were the show people who took their bows, wiped off their grease paint, put on their top hats, and made it to the car or plane or back to the hotel room, and then, like poor Al Dvorin, wound up leaving the building. Next came an accounting of the troopers who didn't quite make it to the stage or set, because death stuck out its bony foot and tripped them up along the way. That exploration became an investigation that landed on an even more surprising and devastating show business phenomenon that has gone, for the most part, unexamined until now: the ones who died on stage while performing. The investigation took us to Broadway shows, nightclubs, dinner theaters, amphitheaters, playhouses, arenas, concert halls, auditoriums, studios, tents, movie sets, and televised events, and introduced us to an illustrious group that includes actors, singers, musicians, magicians, comedians, DJs, chorus girls, models, journeymen, and social media stars, people who are remembered as much for the way they left the building as for what they did inside. We didn't include athletes, fighters, toreadors, race car drivers, or others who entered the field, arena, or ring, accepting that death is always a potential outcome. Initially, we chronicled every recorded death of a performer on stage. Our research led to hundreds of incidents dating back centuries, and a project that turned out to be more comprehensive than any study previously attempted. Urban legends were debunked, long-held assumptions contradicted, Wikipedia-style misinformation corrected, new details from well-known stories unearthed, and the obscure stood, or were laid, shoulder to shoulder with the legendary. As the work continued and the pages flew from the calendar, however, we discovered phenomenon just as compelling and even more frustrating. Performers keep dying on stage. Every month or so, a singer would collapse mid-song, an act of violence would shatter the tranquility of a recital, or one of the new breed of social media personalities would expire live on camera before millions of fans. The number of performers who die on stage is always growing, too many and too often to be contained within the pages of a single volume. So we boiled it down to the onstage deaths that really stood out among the rest. These are performers who died in front of an audience, grouped roughly into the categories of their specialties, with nods to additional related onstage passings that bring the total well into the three-figure range. These are our picks. One can always debate if others deserve equal attention. To die on stage. Is it a curse? Could it be a gift? Is there any consolation in knowing that these performers died doing what they loved? And was it really the way they'd have wanted to go? Some answers and much more will be found in the following. 1. The Guinness World Record. Jane Little. Jane Little stood 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. Yet she played the double bass, the largest instrument in the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and one that stood a good foot taller than she did. She was Jane Finley, and 16 years old when she joined the Atlanta Youth Symphony Orchestra in 1945. She made her debut that February 4th, wearing a pastel evening gown, and she remained with the group when it began to admit adults and grew into the Atlanta Symphony. Jane married the symphony's principal flutist in 1953. Warren Little was 6'2" and would carry his little flute and her big bass. Even after he retired, he'd drive her to and from Atlanta Symphony Hall in their big baby blue Chevrolet Caprice Classic station wagon. During her career, Jane played for conductors such as Igor Stravinsky, Leopold Stokowski, Aaron Copland, and James Levine. In 1996, she performed at the opening and closing ceremonies of the Atlanta Summer Olympics with conductor John Williams. The highlight of her symphonic career came on February 4th, 2016, 2 days after she celebrated her 87th birthday. Jane wasn't in the best of health that day. She had been undergoing chemotherapy treatment for multiple myeloma and had suffered a cracked vertebra the previous August. But after months of rehabilitation, she was ready to play the double bass once more. The Washington Post reported on the occasion, "On Monday, Jane Little got her weekly chemo shot. Thursday, she gulped down 5 green steroid pills and reported to Symphony Hall to fight her way back to the stage. And that she did, all 98 pounds of her, stroking a D chord at 8:04 p.m. to make her comeback official." With that stroke of the bow, Jane Little became holder of the Guinness World Record as the musician with the longest tenure with an orchestra. With 71 years, she passed the record set by Francis Darger, the violinist who'd retired in 2012 after 70 years with the Utah Symphony. Indeed, the prospect of taking the title was one more reason Jane decided to return to the symphony for one last season, despite serious illness and injuries. "I'd thumb through the Guinness Book and say, 'Wouldn't it be neat?'" she told the Post. "A lot of people do crazy things like sitting on a flagpole for 3 days. I just kept on. It was just me and the lady in Utah. So finally I said, I'm going to do this." To Michael Kurth, who joined the bass section in 1994, Jane's accomplishment was less inspirational than mythical. Kurth tells us, "You'd have to be really ambitious to be inspired, because it was such an unattainable record. To spend that many years on the job, it's almost inconceivable. She was certainly a great musician. Nobody can stand in that job for long unless they have real intuitive and innate musicality, and her technique was amazing. Her hands were so flexible. I would sit behind her and her thumb would bend in angles that I didn't think human thumbs could bend." Jane and her double bass were on stage on the afternoon of Sunday, May 15th, 2016, for an Atlanta Symphony Pops concert. Broadway's golden age was a great rousing show. For an encore, the program called for a tune from Irving Berlin's classic musical, Annie Get Your Gun. The players were about 30 seconds from the final measures of the encore number when Jane stopped playing. Michael Kurth was playing bass right beside her, sharing her music stand. "There were maybe 10 measures left in the last piece of the last program of the year," he says, "and I suddenly saw, out of the corner of my eye, her falling. Her bass teetered over and crashed into my bass. There's still a gouge in my bass from it, and she just collapsed over, unresponsive." Kurth and tuba player Michael Moore, a mere 49-year veteran of the orchestra, carried the tiny double bassist off the stage while the rest of the orchestra went on with the show and completed the number. A physician who was a member of the orchestra and a nurse from the audience worked to revive her, but Jane Little never regained consciousness. After the paramedics took Jane away, Michael Kurth joined most of the orchestra backstage behind the bass section. There were tears and hugs. We weren't calculating and assessing the momentousness of the occasion. We were just reacting and trying to... it's our Jane. We all loved Jane," he says. That night, Kurth told the Washington Post, "She seemed to be made of bass resin and barbed wire. She was unstoppable. I honestly thought I was going to retire before she did." The Atlanta Symphony Orchestra announced on Facebook that it would dedicate the following weekend's performances to the late Jane Little. One commenter on the site said she was still shaken after witnessing her collapse, but added, "R.I.P., dear lady. You are an inspiration." Another called the final concert at Atlanta Symphony Hall harrowing, but added that Jane Little died doing what she loved. "What an amazing way to go," orchestra fan Amanda Turner wrote. Senior orchestra manager Russell Williamson marveled at the timing. For her to go out at the end of the concert, the golden age of Broadway, and it was during the encore, he told the Post. Michael Kurth points out that when she played her last note, she was doing what she loved, surrounded by people she loved, in a place that was like home to her. "It was a pretty spectacular exit, frankly," he says, "for a really spectacular lady. I mean, you really couldn't write a better Hollywood ending." Had the actual ending been scripted by a Hollywood screenwriter, reviewers would say it was too obvious. The song that Jane Little was performing when she collapsed to the stage was "There's No Business Like Show Business." 2. Theater. Corpsing is British theatrical slang for unintentionally breaking character by laughing. The origin of the term has never been nailed down, but it most likely arose from a laughing fit by an actor portraying a corpse. Another, far more literal interpretation of corpsing would be to actually become a corpse on stage, by dying. This has happened many times in many venues over the years. If there's a stage on which to act, there's a public platform on which to drop dead. Some on-stage deaths are more obvious than others. The 17th-century French actor and playwright, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, known to the world as Molière, was 51 and suffering from tuberculosis on February 17, 1673, when he performed in the title role in his play, Le Malade Imaginaire, the Hypochondriac, for King Louis XIV at the Théâtre du Palais Royal in Paris. Already so ill that he was forced to perform while sitting in a red velvet chair, he was seized by a violent coughing fit and began hemorrhaging from the mouth. "Don't be alarmed, I'm not dead," Molière announced, insisting on going on with the show before he collapsed after an even more copious hemorrhage. They carried him off stage in his red velvet chair. No hypochondriac, he was indeed dead within a few hours. Then there was Emil Hasta, the comedic actor who in 1904 starred in a Berlin Touring Company production of Ludwig Fulda's play, The Twin Sister. When the show opened at the Municipal Theater in Nimpcz, Poland, on March 24th, he had the crowd roaring with laughter through the first act and received half a dozen curtain calls. On the 6th, he drew a revolver from his hip pocket, placed it to his temple, and in front of the entire audience pulled the trigger and blew out his brains. One wire service reported that, when the blood was seen to flow, women fainted and men fought their way to the stage to get a glimpse at the suicide. Apparently, one of the actresses had rejected his proposal of marriage. If Hasta's suicide seems an overreaction, consider Ludwig Heinle. On October 26, 1926, the actor ran on stage and stabbed himself to death with a dagger during a performance of Peer Gynt at the Municipal Theater in Strasbourg, France. He was upset that the stage manager gave him a hard time for showing up late. Despite such histrionics, the most memorable deaths on stage are ones in which an actor recites a line and then takes his or her leave from the stage in mortal coil, as if on cue. The exit line often serves as an all-too-perfect setup for the ultimate punchline. Most of the time, the audience thinks it's part of the show. Joe Greenwald. After 3 weeks of rehearsals in Los Angeles, Homer Curran's road production of Golden Boy rolled north in March 1938 for 2 tryout performances at the Libero Theater in Santa Barbara. The show, starring Francis Lederer, would be a hot ticket. Clifford Odets's acclaimed play about violinist-turned-prizefighter Joe Bonaparte was a smash hit on Broadway and still running at the Belasco Theater on West 44th Street. where it had opened the previous November with Luther Adler in the title role and Frances Farmer as his love interest. The only omen of any potential problems was that the first road performance was scheduled for April Fool's Day. 21-year-old future movie star Glenn Ford had the job as stage manager, and 2 lines in the third act: "Knockout" and "Lombardo's stiff." "Actors are a very superstitious breed," he told his son Peter, as noted in the latter's biography, Glenn Ford, A Life. So there was already some feeling of uneasiness among some in the cast. The curtain went up and everything went smoothly, until we got to the second scene. In the second scene of the first act, Joe's father, Mr. Bonaparte, shows off the expensive violin he plans to give his son the next day for his 21st birthday. The actor playing the boxer's immigrant father in the play, Joe Greenwald, said his line, "A good life is possible," and suddenly collapsed dead of a heart attack, Ford remembered. "I rushed onto the stage immediately. He was lying in the arms of one of the other actors." The trade journal Variety reported a different line in the Golden Boy script as the 60-year-old actor's final words. He had just concluded his line, "This is the moment for which I have waited," when he collapsed. The New York Times offered its own version. Mr. Greenwald had just uttered the opening lines of a speech, "All my life," when he crumpled to the floor. So there's some confusion. A good life, is possible. This is the moment for which I have waited. All my life. Any of those reported last words would suffice, as Joseph Greenwald's body lay motionless, and Sam White, the only other actor on the stage at the time, called frantically for the curtain. The curtain was dropped, the capacity audience was eventually dismissed, and everyone got refunds. The Santa Barbara Fire Department's pulmotor squad tried to revive Greenwald, to no avail. He was already dead, Glenn Ford said. God, what an experience. There was no understudy for Joe Greenwald, so the show was shut down for a week until a replacement was found. The producers brought in Lee J. Cobb from the original Broadway production. Edith Webster. Edith Webster died on stage every night. For 8 years, she'd played the role of the grandmother in community theater productions of The Drunkard at the Moose Lodge Inn in Towson, Maryland. In each performance, the role called for her character to sing a song, then collapse to the floor dead. That's what she did on Saturday night, November 22nd, 1986. There was tremendous applause. Hearing that, she died, the director Richard Burt told United Press International. The applause was the last thing Edith Webster would ever hear. When the other actors called for a doctor and phoned paramedics, most of the 200 people in the audience thought Edith's exit was part of the show. When the performance was stopped and they realized Edith had died of a heart attack, most of the audience sat quietly for almost an hour. Some of them prayed. Edith Webster was 60. Her daughter, Mary Todd Webster, told the UPI reporter that the way she went was not a bad thing. A lot of people have been saying it. Night after night she died and she died, Director Burt observed. And last night she died and she really did. By the way, what was the name of Edith's show-stopping song? Please don't talk about me when I'm gone. Kent Stork. Kent Stork was a community theater actor whose death was notable not only for his dedication as an amateur thespian, but also for the name of the last play in which he starred. Kent was already well known to a certain audience long before he stepped onto a stage. For 39 years, he and his wife Joyce ran a flower shop in Fremont, Nebraska, and over time became leading experts on the African violet. Kent won a dozen major awards at national flower shows. He and Joyce traveled as far away as Russia and Hong Kong to speak to growers. They wrote a column for African Violet magazine that was turned into the book, You Can Grow African Violets. One Amazon.com reviewer called the book, My AV Bible. After Kent and Joyce hit 65, they decided to retire. They closed Kent's Flowers in August 2016 and began packing for a move to Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Las Vegas. There they'd be close to their son Zach and his family, and Kent could follow his passion. Not African violets, but show business. Kent had been bitten by the acting bug several years earlier, when he and Joyce had attended a play in Omaha, and he was invited on stage. He won his first role playing the superintendent in an Omaha Community Playhouse production of The Drowsy Chaperone. He'd appear in 4 more productions, including one in which he acted while inside an iron lung. It would have been January 2017 when they arrived in Henderson, Zach Stork tells us. They rolled into town at like 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock p.m., and my dad had been looking at his phone on the way in, and there was a tryout for a play that was happening that night. He'd been in the car all day, and everyone's exhausted, and he's leaving at 9 to go try out for a play somewhere. So that was definitely going to be his retirement hobby. Kent didn't get that part, but within months won a starring role at Henderson's Community Theater Company, Theater in the Valley. The dark comedy opened on Friday night, April 21st, and was set to continue for 8 more weekend performances. On Sunday, April 30th, Kent and Joyce attended church and Bible class before Kent took the stage for the 2 p.m. matinee. Joyce was in the audience. When he first comes out on stage, it was supposed to be like he had just gotten out of a shower, Zach says. So he came out soaking wet, and my mom could just tell that he seemed a little off. And she knew the script well enough that she could tell that he missed a line. He didn't look right, Joyce later told the Fremont Tribune. His coloring wasn't right. He was panting, and I kept waiting for the panting to stop, and it didn't. Then I realized he was having trouble standing. They completed part of a scene and he exited, Zach explains. The funny part, this story that I tell people, is that my mom was there, and she saw him not looking well. And then he kissed another woman, put a gun into his robe, exited the stage, and that was kind of the last she saw him fully conscious. The director came and got my mom. My dad was backstage trying to fight to the bitter end, saying that he just needed to catch his breath. Then it was like, no, we need to call 911. The show was stopped. Paramedics arrived and rushed Kent Stork to St. Rose Dominican Hospital. Zach posted on Facebook from the hospital the following day. Great and sad news from the last 24 hours. This morning, Jana and I were blessed with the birth of our beautiful daughter, Lydia, and they are both doing well. The sad part is that my dad, Kent Stork, suffered a heart attack yesterday afternoon and died in this very same hospital less than 9 hours before his granddaughter was born. Circle of life. It's kind of interesting how things line up like that, Zach says. We were preparing for my daughter to come, and then a surprise heart attack that happened less than 24 hours before. It's actually good that he was pronounced dead a little before midnight, so he and my daughter don't share the same date of departure and arrival. Kent Stork had died 2 days before his 67th birthday. Zach's mother, Joyce, a devout Lutheran, told the Tribune's Tammy Reel McKeegan that she was comforted knowing that her husband was safe in the Lord's hands, and that, when the last day comes, that I'll be there too, and that we'll see the Lord together. How about Zach, the eldest of Kent Stork's 2 sons? Did he take comfort knowing his father died, doing what he loved? You know what, he replies, I do. Because he had gone from working 50, 60 hours a week for 4 decades and then retired, and 6 months later, he was gone. But he was able to go doing something that he was interested in. Honestly, my dad was somebody who liked attention, and the day he died, for at least a couple of hours, he was trending. When you went to the main website of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, his death story was above the story about the new Raiders stadium being built. He would have been kind of tickled to know that his passing garnered such attention. There was another reason that Kent Stork's death got attention. The name of the play was Art of Murder. Zach is able to laugh about that. When the newspaper posted the link to the article to Facebook, I couldn't help but read through some of the comments, he says. Some were like, Sounds like a bad episode of Murder, She Wrote. That's kind of funny. He continues, when he was brought to the hospital, he had this stage gun in his pocket. I think the hospitals here are used to having real guns come into the emergency room, and my mom actually got a call late that night from the coroner's office to see if she thought this was a suspicious death that needed to be investigated. No, not because of the name of the play. I think it was just because of the odd circumstances, where he died while performing. David Burns. Broadway star David Burns was singing, dancing, and acting his heart out on Friday, March 12, 1971. He was on stage at the Forest Theater in Philadelphia in an out-of-town tryout for John Kander and Fred Ebb's latest musical, 70 Girls 70. Kander and Ebb had written the songs for Cabaret. They'd go on to musicals like Chicago and Fosse, and write New York, New York, the Liza Minnelli showstopper that became Frank Sinatra's anthem. But this show was a bit more risky in concept. The plot concerned the residents of a retirement hotel, and 70 was the average age of the cast members. Each night, producer Arthur Whitelaw had to worry about whether the entire cast would survive to make it to Broadway. In fact, Burns, best known for his long-running role as Horace Vandergelder in Hello, Dolly, had signed on to play Harry the desk clerk only weeks earlier. He was 68 and had replaced Eddie Foy Jr., who couldn't remember his lines at 66. On stage on this night, everyone was doing just fine. The show was getting laughs and the musical numbers were boffo. Then, around 10 p.m., near the end of the second act, David Burns literally sang and danced and acted his heart out. In the middle of the number, he exclaimed, "How about this move?" He did a double take and spun around. The audience roared with laughter. Burns then clutched his chest and fell to the stage. It was a heart attack. During the confusion that followed, Burns's understudy, Coley Worth, helped drag his body off stage. Backstage, Worth tried to revive him. To no avail. David Burns was dead. Producer Arthur Whitelaw did his best to put a positive spin, no pun intended, on the death of his star. He went, I guess, the way he would have liked to have gone. He died the way he lived. He died after one of the biggest laughs of the evening. Whitelaw later told Coley Worth to prepare to take over the role of Harry the desk clerk for the Saturday matinee. Worth's life had led to this moment. He was born Coleman Rothman, 62 years earlier, and first took the stage as a kid, performing in his father's minstrel show before running away to join a vaudeville circuit. He made his Broadway debut in 1927 in a show called A la Carte, and in the decades since had been in countless productions. He'd understudied for David Burns in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and Hello, Dolly, but had never been given a chance like this. He managed 5 hours of sleep that night and was back on the Forest Theater stage at 9 a.m. Saturday morning, rehearsing for the 2 p.m. show. He went over the book piece by piece. This early in the process, there were many scenes he hadn't yet studied. He knew he'd have to wing it and do the best he could. That's what Coley Worth did. He learned what he could, and when he hit the stage for the show, he let instinct handle the rest. When he missed a cue or flubbed a line, he improvised. He invented. He ad-libbed. The audience was never the wiser. Arthur Whitelaw and the other backers stood at the back of the house and knew they were witnessing something very special. After the show, Whitelaw came backstage and embraced the actor. "Well, we got through it," Worth said. "It was fine, fine," Whitelaw assured him. "You did a wonderful job." Teary-eyed co-stars congratulated him, whispered a bravo, and patted him on the back. Someone asked Coley Worth if he thought he'd wind up taking over the leading role on Broadway. Coley smiled wistfully, sadly, knowingly. "They'll probably bring in a star," he said. He was correct. After the evening performance, Arthur Whitelaw closed the show and announced that the play was heading back to rehearsals in New York. When 70's Girls 70 opened at the Broadhurst Theater on April 15, 1971, Hans Conried was starring in David Burns's role. The show ran for 9 previews and 35 performances before it closed, a month later. Coley Worth lived to 79. He died of pneumonia in Port St. Lucie, Florida.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?